Welcome to the Near Memo, a weekly conversation about search, social, and commerce. What happened, why it matters, and the implications for local. All right, so moving on to AI yet again, which there never ceases to be interesting things to talk about, at least for the foreseeable future. Today, I'm going to talk about liability with copyright liability. So, over the course of the last, let's say, week and a half, Getty Images has sued Stable Diffusion and maybe a couple of the others. I think Stable Diffusion in particular. And there have been 3 individual women artists who have also sued Stable Diffusion. I think Midjourney Discord is part of that, for appropriating their imagery, their intellectual property, without permission. In the Getty Images case, the Getty watermark started showing up in some of the outputs. So it was very obvious that those were some of the images that were being used to create sort of the generative AI photography or pseudo-photography. And I don't know how the 3 female artists identified that their material was in these generative AI outputs. There's also Copilot is being sued, which is the automated coding tool that's being sued, and there may be 1 or 2 other suits. But the point is, now people are recognizing that the material that's being used, the training sets for these data, are mostly copyrighted information. Most of the internet is copyrighted material. Somebody has produced it. So whether that's companies or individuals, whatever, these huge, massive training sets that are being used for all these AI tools are feeding off of copyrighted information. And it's harder on the text side, but what we saw this past week is that CNET, which had sort of copped to the idea that it was producing AI articles which were filled with errors, they then found out that they contained plagiarized material. I don't know exactly how that was discovered, but that was apparently true. So you've got this potential problem before the courts, which is copyrighted material is being used to train these sausage factories, and they're outputting this sort of hybrid material that is basically using that. What is the court going to, ultimately this will wind up in the U.S. Supreme Court, and I don't know what will happen in Europe. What is going to happen? It's a fascinating legal question, because identifying the underlying owner of the copyright is a problem, especially when you're talking about text. So the courts could just simply the Getty Images case is a slam dunk, but otherwise the courts could just throw up their hands and say, well, because we have such difficulty identifying particular copyright owners, and because the scale of this is so large, we're just not going to do anything. Tough luck. And it's reminiscent of a Yellow Pages case that sort of paved the way for the local internet, which I can tell you about in a second. Feist versus, I think it was Regional Telephone Directories, one of the baby bells. The idea was, can third parties take and extract the information from a print directory? And the publisher said, no, that was copyrighted. And the court said, you can't copyright factual information. And so they could take and get all the listings information and then turn it into something else and republish it. And that was perfectly legal. And that really paved the way in some respects for everything we're doing today. I think that was back in the late 70s or very, very early 80s. I think it was maybe the late 70s.
Isn't all writing at some level generative, though, and built on ideas of others? There's no original.
Well,
there's very few original storylines. But the point with generative AI is that there's a difference between plagiarism and generation. And it is conceivable to me that they could overcome plagiarism by rephrasing, re-articulating, changing the text enough so that it does not appear to be plagiarism.
Well, I mean, plagiarism is verbatim copying, right? So there is this notion of fair use, which is a defense to copyright, which doesn't really work in cases where you're trying to make a lot of money. But it's a fascinating question. I mean, you're right that if you take something and change it enough where it just becomes the inspiration for the new thing that you're creating, then arguably it's not a copyright violation. But if you take something pretty explicitly clear, and like this happens in songwriting, this happens in music also, where people have to pay royalties to to another songwriter because the new song is too similar. So I think all of these copyright issues are really fascinating and really problematic because we're in an area of law which is, like a lot of these new technology areas, it's way ahead of where the courts are. And the practical problem would be if the courts come down and say, hey, all of this copyrighted material is being improperly used, then the question is, it raises the question, what is plagiarism on one level, which is probably pretty well defined in the case law. But it raises the question of, like, how do you find the sources? I mean, I think on the text side, it's a much harder matter than on the image side.
It's just one of the many problems our society is going to deal with AI. We've talked about others, right? I mean, ethics and morals and all, jobs and all these other things. I mean, AI it is coming. The big guys have the guns to pull it off, the computing power to pull it off. Very few other people do. I mean, the whole thing, when you look at the ChatGPT funding, it's based on their need for computing power. Microsoft is paying them with compute cycles, funding them with compute cycles. It's like, and so only the biggest companies can do this. So it's interesting times.
That's a very important issue because, Google has got sued by the Department of Justice for antitrust around its display advertising business. And the complaint about these big tech companies is that they're gatekeepers. They control everything. They control access to these systems. And AI becomes a very, very critical and important tool that is going to be absolutely everywhere. And if it's only controlled by a handful of companies that have the processing power, that's a problem, I think.
Who are friendly with a handful of governments creates other tensions, geopolitical tensions. And I think AI is one of those areas where China is concerned that Google and Microsoft are U.S. favored companies. And so it leads to virtually every aspect of our lives is going to come into play, from copyright to employment to geopolitics. It's a big topic.
But it's a fad, according to the agencies surveyed in the Colorado survey.
Yeah, maybe it'll pass. Maybe it'll pass. Yeah.
Well, back to the sort of possible remedies here, Greg. So would I think it's NEVA that's doing this? Would an instantiation of an AI result similar to what NEVA does, with sort of citing the 3 or 4 sources from which this was primarily derived, would that be sufficient, or is that still not likely to fall under the fair use banner?
I think that's probably sufficient. Perplexity AI, which is another one to check out, I think that's the best version of what NEVA is doing, which is to create an answer and then cite the sources. I think that probably would be sufficient, because the answer itself, unless it's a verbatim recitation of something without any attribution, would be considered an appropriate. I mean, that would probably fall under fair use, I'm guessing. Even though the search engine itself is making money on some level, so that's probably a good solution to the text problem.
And didn't you mention in the newsletter that that's what Google is looking at? That sourcing references.
Yeah, I mean, I think very quickly that becomes the standard that you have to adhere to. I mean, it depends on the use case, right? I mean, there's a lot of ChatGPT use cases where you're going to have somebody write something that you're then going to edit, and you don't necessarily need sources. You might need sources to evaluate the accuracy of the information, but you're not explicitly publishing the thing verbatim to somebody in the way that a search engine or a news publisher is presenting information.
However, if that were required, I think it would help startup search engines build their link graphs very, very quickly in terms of where it is the original sort of back rub algorithm from Sergey and Larry. So,
yeah. And it's just, I mean, what's going on right now with AI and search, and we're in a really, really interesting time. And I think I included this as yesterday that Yahoo is apparently going to do something in search, and we'll see what that is. I'm skeptical, but we'll see what they're going to come out with.
Thanks for joining David, Mike, and Greg. To stay on top of the latest developments in local, subscribe to our newsletter at nearmedia.co. We'll see you next week.